Dean Lach.
Good morning. All right, good response on this beautiful Sunday morning. Well, welcome to the George Washington University Alumni and Families Weekend panel on the Multifaceted Landscape of AI. My name is John Lach, Dean of this GW School of Engineering and Applied Science, and I will be moderating today's panel. But first, it is my pleasure to introduce the 19th president of the George Washington University, Dr. Ellen M. Granberg.
Well, thank you, Dean Lach, and good morning, everyone. Have you had a good weekend? Yeah, excellent. Well, we're all so glad that you have been with us this weekend. I think the energy has been amazing. This is Sonia's and my very first Alumni and Family Weekend, and I think it's fair to say, we had a blast. Yeah, just amazing. And for those of you who are students in the audience, I also really hope that you enjoyed having your parents with you and your family with you and got some reconnection opportunities, and hopefully you bragged on GW just a little bit so they know what a great time you're having. I'm so excited about this topic this morning. The George Washington University has a tremendous legacy of impact across a really broad range of disciplines. We produce very, very high-level scholarship that we're extremely proud of across a wide range of disciplines and subject topics. One of the things I love the most about GW is that it doesn't just produce scholarship to sit on a shelf. It produces scholarship to make a difference. We have students and faculty working on real-world solutions to some of our most pressing challenges and our most exciting opportunities. And of course, I think we all know that those two things are deeply integrated when it comes to artificial intelligence. We all know that the field of AI is really rapidly transforming the world around us. It is impacting everything from how we learn to how we communicate to how we do business, and on and on and on. And as the world grapples with this new technology, I am very proud of the fact that GW is a key voice in the national and international conversation and in the ongoing efforts to ensure that AI can have a safe and positive and generative impact on the world. So today's discussion, which is titled The Multifaceted Landscape of AI, highlights one of the reasons why I think GW is at the heart of this conversation, and it's our ability to leverage the expertise of a very distinguished faculty across a wide range of disciplines, and to do it right in the nation's capital. So if we take our diverse and talented faculty, if we take our proximity, we have this unique opportunity to connect science and technology and innovation with law and policy and ethics. And it's because of these strengths that we are now co-leading a multi-university team that's creating the Institute for Trustworthy AI in Law and Society, or TRAILS. This is funded with a $20 million grant from the National Science Foundation. It is the very first multidisciplinary research institute designed to explore trust and ethics in AI systems. And it'll guide the development of laws and policies that ensure we harness this astonishing tool in ways that enhance the education, our economy, and our overall human condition. By collaborating across differences and working directly with impacted communities, we can add value to traditional academic disciplines. We can prepare our students to succeed in an increasingly complex and interdisciplinary world, and we can ensure that our research will have a very real and immediate impact on society. And I can't think of any area where it is more important to do that right now than artificial intelligence. So today's conversation, which is hosted by Dean John Lach, is going to explore GW's work in this area. We're going to be examining cross-cutting research that is happening at the forefront of this critical technology and talk about some of its implications. So before I close, I do want to thank all of you again for joining us for the 2023 Alumni and Families Weekend. I'm now going to turn the podium back to Dean Lach, who will facilitate today's discussion. Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you next year.
Well, thank you, President Granberg, and we really appreciate your support of this really important work. As President Granberg said, artificial intelligence really seems to be exploding all around us with innovations and technology releases that are impacting not just every sector of industry, but every part of our society, and even raising philosophical questions about the notion of intelligence and what it means to be human. And here at GW, we are taking a holistic approach to AI research and education with computer scientists and engineers working side by side with faculty and students across GW to tackle not just the technical challenges and opportunities of AI, but the societal dimensions of AI. So it is therefore with great enthusiasm that I introduce our 4 faculty panelists who represent 3 different GW schools. And the truth is, we could have filled this stage with dozens of faculty from every single school at GW, as AI at GW is truly a pan-university effort. But of course, we'd be here until Tuesday with such a large panel of faculty, so we kept it to these 4 brilliant faculty members for today. Their full bios are in the online program, but I would like to briefly introduce each of them now. Rebecca Hua is a professor and chair of the Computer Science Department in GW Engineering. Rebecca just joined GW this fall after serving as a program director for the National Science Foundation's Division of Information and Intelligent Systems. Professor Zoe Szajnfarber is a professor of engineering management and systems engineering and the director of strategic initiatives in GW Engineering. And she leads our research traineeship program on the co-design of trustworthy AI systems. Susan Aaronson is a research professor in the Elliott School of International Affairs, and she is one of the faculty leaders of our newly funded AI Institute, TRAILS, Trustworthy AI in Law and Society. Ryan Watkins is a professor of educational technology in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development, and he is the program director of the Educational Technology Leadership Program. So thank you all for sharing your expertise with us today. So I'd like to start with a broad but important and fairly complex question of simply what is AI, and maybe to address any misconceptions, what isn't AI? Rebecca, would you like to take that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my background is in artificial intelligence. I studied it the first time in 1989, was an undergraduate, and kind of saw the ups and downs of AI over the decades in the past. So I wanted to kind of go back a little bit because the first thing that happens when you go into an AI class is you have to define what is AI. And the definition is actually pretty vague because people don't agree on what intelligence necessarily means. So I think in the beginning, people have lots of ideas about what they wanted out of an artificial intelligence system. I think people typically kind of defaulted to behaving like a person or acting like a person, thinking like a person. And so if you kind of look in the science fiction world, even as early as, say, Wizard of Oz, the Tin Man is kind of an example. Or if you're into black and white silent films, one of my favorites, Metropolis, has a false Maria, and that also is an example of kind of early perceptions of AI. In the 1950s is when kind of computer science really kind of started to think about it more scientifically. We have Alan Turing coming up with kind of a formal definition of a Turing test as a way to kind of distinguish between human versus a system. The test is basically if you, as a person, is interacting with something, you can't see whether the response sounded like a person to you or not. If it did, then it passes the Turing test. Otherwise, it doesn't. And so for many years, that's kind of what people think about achieving over time. But over time, people ask, well, is that really a good definition, or is that not a good definition? Because you could potentially have something that just talks its head off and it seems like it's intelligent, but it actually isn't. And in this day and age of ChatGPT, I think that's become an interesting question to re-examine again. But going back into the 1950s, there were a whole bunch of enthusiasm and optimism about the future of AI. People were developing systems. They have things that can prove theorems, complicated mathematical theorems. And it seemed like AI is going to be solved in 10 years, and that's what people thought. It didn't, because once you take the system outside of its kind of predefined box, everything breaks. And so then we had kind of a depressed time about the 1980s. That was kind of what's called the AI winter for the first time. That's when basically people thought AI was going to change everything, but it didn't. And so it under-delivered, and so people suddenly were very depressed about it, and funding were pulled. And so when I went into school, actually, what I was told was, don't do AI because that's bad. But I was really interested in it, so I was working on it, and they said, well, you can work on it, but it's natural language processing, it's speech recognition, it's robotics, it's not AI. Now we say, oh, it's AI. But so in the 90s, we had a whole lot of kind of real-world applications. They're being intelligent, right? So you can call up, I mean, I know you guys all have experiences with telephone systems where, say 1 to reach this office, and say 2, and the system recognizes your voice and correctly transports you to the right place. So in terms of speech recognition, that kind of work was well established. You have medical systems that helps diagnosing complicated syndromes. You have recommender systems. If you go onto Amazon, they will recommend you the best books or movies or whatever you like. So in those specific directions, AI was making progress, but it was a very kind of data-driven machine learning statistical approach, and artificial intelligence was kind of not really mentioned as such, even though it is artificial intelligence. And then neural network, which I have not talked about yet, its history actually started all the way back in the 40s as well, but slowly it has fits and starts as well. In the 2010s, suddenly it became kind of critical mass has been reached, and so suddenly now a lot of the techniques that were developed a long time ago now can kind of come to fruition because we have fast enough machines, we have enough data, and we have developed the algorithms well enough. And so suddenly you see a lot of successes, and successes breeds more successes. And so here we are, 2023, and everybody is talking about AI again. And again, I'm a little bit worried about overhyping and not have another winter. So that's kind of where I see it. And so what I want to say what AI is not, it is not sentient. So I remember seeing some kind of debate on whether it's a sentient being or not. It's not. It's not. It's not general enough. So people also talk about general intelligence. It's not that. We are not there. But it is very, very good at what it does. And so I think today, I hope, at least from my perspective, I wanted to communicate what it is. And maybe it doesn't sound that exciting, but the effect is actually quite breathtaking.
Great, thank you. From the perspective of the other disciplines, do you have thoughts about what is and isn't AI?
She did a great job.
Great.
Yeah, kind of my general definition I think of when I talk with my kids about it is it doing something that we thought only humans could do just a short time ago? This is not my definition, it's someone else's, but it's a good way to think about it. And if the system is doing something that until recently we thought only a human could possibly do, such as write poetry or create songs and doing these things, then we can start to think of that as AI, not in the computer science term, but for the rest of us in other disciplines where we don't get as technical about that.
Maybe I'll just add one thing, and we're going to talk more about this on the rest of the panel, I think, but a lot of what's being called AI doesn't meet either of those definitions, and some of the challenges is that we're bucketing a lot of different things into the umbrella of AI, and some of the things we should worry about apply to one and not the other, and some of the things that they can do, when you bucket too much, you can get into trouble.
Well, speaking of worrying about AI, Zoe, another common question is, should we be scared of AI? And how are we I mentioned that holistic approach that we're taking here at GW. How are we addressing some of those issues that have caused concern and fear among the public?
It's almost like I knew a question was coming. So I get that question quite a lot lately. It's still a bit surprising to me how often I get that question, and people usually mean one of two things. Is AI coming for my job, or are we on the verge of a robot apocalypse? And since if we're on the verge of an apocalypse, you probably don't care so much about your job, let me talk about that one first. So am I personally worried that the robots are going to rise up and take over society? No. This really talks to the general intelligence that Rebecca was just talking about. If you've worked in robotics, you know that any AI that's embodied, that means in some kind of physical form, is still slow and really only works on very constrained tasks. So I'm not super worried about that one. But that doesn't mean that there's not the risk of an existential threat that everyone's talking about. But that's more at the level of disrupting the fabric of society, which is probably more scary than robots rising up against us. So let me unpack what I mean. So first of all, AI by itself is math instantiated as an algorithm, and it does what it does. It does exactly what it does. And so that's not something to be scared of per se, but increasingly, where in the past AI kind of lived in a vacuum, that isn't true anymore. It's being embedded into systems that interact with people, and more importantly, lots of people in a societal kind of context, and that's where things can get much more scary. So take the recommender example for a second. Functionally, all it's doing is choosing an objective function, what we're trying to get more of, that's deciding which book to recommend first, or what news article that you're going to see first among the hundreds of news articles that you could see. And that decision seems small. There are lots of perfectly good decisions that you could make about what makes that particular news article show up first. But when that lives in an organization that's trying to make money, which again is a pretty reasonable goal, and they discover that people are more likely to spend time on their platform if they're more stimulated by, say, being angry in a shared sense with people who think the way that they do. All of a sudden, if you turn on the learning and let the algorithm figure out how to make more money, now we're going to start getting people to talk to smaller and smaller groups that agree with each other and make you angry. And so we all know what can happen when that implication happens. So that's where it gets to be scary. So should I fear the AI? It's not the AI, it's the way that AI engages with society. And that's really the perspective that we're trying to take here at GW. It's not just about the technology we're developing, it's about understanding it in context. And so I come from a systems engineering perspective, and one of our core truths, I guess, of systems engineering is that it's much easier to fix problems before you deploy the system. But that means you have to be able to understand these kinds of long-run interactions. And now that we've tried a few things, we really are at a place where we can look at key issues from most disciplines that the way you design the architecture of the system can have a big impact on how well you can control it. For example, one of our colleagues, who's the GW lead for the Institute, we're going to be talking a lot about, David Broniatowski, just published a really interesting paper that looks at the way that Facebook groups were constructed from a system architecture perspective. And you can predict what's going to be easy to control or not based on the initial structure, these very, very low-level design decisions that a computer scientist who's building a platform is making without necessarily being able to understand what can happen next. And so we bring together a lot of disciplines. We try to think about the technology in its context. We start to think about how these design decisions are going to affect the long-run implications. And so when we say governance, we mean something much more than can we just regulate it? We think about at the design stage what we can do, and that you can only do when you bring these great disciplines together. And now I'll come back a little bit to the how is this going to affect your job, because if the robots aren't going to rise up, maybe you still do care about that. It's something that I study personally quite a lot, so I'll try to be really brief and use maybe a lighter example of the role that generative AI can play in a workflow. So I have young kids, and they are connoisseurs of bedtime stories, shall we say. And so they'll regularly ask me to just sing a parody of their favorite nursery rhyme, but put in their favorite character. And that used to be really cognitively taxing at the end of the day. But now it turns out that Pi.ai is fantastic at that particular task. And so we can write a new verse of Brahms' lullaby that's about Spider-Man, or whatever they happen to come up with every day. And so have I delegated my parenting to ChatGPT? I hope the answer is no. My older son thinks I have, and my younger son thinks I haven't. But what's interesting about this is there are certain tasks that AI is particularly good at. These are fill-in-the-blank machines, after all, and there are certain tasks that they're not. And I often have to say, no, I'm not going to sing that verse. Try again, and let's change it in this way. And fundamentally, innovation is about variation, retention, and selection on a lot of different design decisions. And so AI is particularly good at the variation part, but it's not very good at the selection part. I don't want AI selecting for me. And so that means that when we look at all these jobs, if we can think about reallocating tasks, giving what's good to AI, letting people do the more interesting part, it is going to have an impact on what people's jobs are. I think it's going to have a huge impact on what people's jobs are. But hopefully, unlike past industrial revolutions where it just takes out whole sections of kinds of jobs, it's going to be more integrated. And the kinds of capabilities that you had before are going to be transferred to other things. And so it's hopefully going to be a more smooth transition. But it really comes down to thinking hard about AI as a different source of expertise that can be plugged into a workflow.
I hadn't thought about worrying about my parent role being taken over, so thank you for planting that seed in my head.
Can I add something to
please,
that?
yes, Susan.
So I'm only, like Zoe, I'm only talking about generative AI. But AI, this type of AI is built on huge pools of data. Where does that data come from? Right, it's proprietary data, so data that the corporation has acquired through its interaction with its customers. When I say the corporation, the corporation or the group of individuals that designed and developed and deployed, and those may be different corporations, the AI. So where does that data come from? Like I'm saying, proprietary data, data that that corporation has acquired, can also be data that that corporation has bought, and then data generally scraped from the web, from a web scraper. And so what is that? It's a picture of the web at a point in time. There's nothing inherently wrong with doing that. And that can provide a large pool of data by which you could use generative AI to make predictions, to make decisions, et cetera. The problem with that is that people don't yet ask, is that data accurate or valid for the problem you're trying to address? Is that data complete? And is that data representative? And just addressing the last one, and then I'll shut up, I just want you all to think about it. When you're thinking about AI, by definition, how could it be representative? Here's why. You know, in the United States, more than 80% of people are online, but not everybody is online. So it can't even be representative for the United States, let alone the world, where in the developing world, very few people are online, right? And so, you know, does that really provide a complete, accurate, representative picture to answer the questions? And that fact alone explains, it's not the only reason, but it explains why many people are afraid to use that data and to use things like ChatGPT because they see it making things up. And they use a term that humans, it's as if humans are doing this thing. They call this hallucinating. But it's not really hallucinating, right? So it's something to think about, the quality of the data that underpins this. And that data use is really not regulated very much. It is regulated in some countries, but we are way behind in terms of thinking about how do we regulate the use of that data in such a way that we do not stifle innovation, which is very difficult to do, that we can evolve as the technology evolves, which is probably even harder to do, and then finally, that can make sure that human rights, whether individuals or groups of people, their rights are protected.
Great, yeah, thank you. And I know we're going to be getting back a little bit later in the panel about issues of bias and other ethical issues that exist as a result of what you were just saying. And you mentioned regulation, governance around these kinds of things. I think that we all feel that maybe the technology is way out ahead of the governance right now, but I do know that that are up on the Capitol Hill, the White House, trying to catch up by bringing in some of these industry leaders. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening around governance and AI right now and where you think we need to go with that as technology continues to progress?
Well, it's interesting. The United States belongs to this club. It's called the OECD. And the OECD, for many years, worked on the notion of trying to build trustworthy AI, just like Zoe's initiative at GW. And the idea here was that we can't, society can't live with a technology that people don't trust, right? Because trust is the social capital. Trust is what makes society function, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, I bet Professor Granberg would do a better job, or our president would do a better job of explaining that because I'm not a sociologist. But I found in almost everything that I do, trust is the grease that makes government or even any relationship work, right? You trust that your husband will not cheat on you. You trust that your child is not lying to you when she says, Mom, I didn't take Molly or whatever drug they had at the latest party, right? And so, and same, in a country where you have to have trust between the government and the governed. Okay, so the idea here is that if we can build trust in the technology, right, that people will be much more willing to accept the changes that that technology may have on society. So for a long time, the United States was trying to build trust. And we didn't essentially regulate AI. But starting in the Trump administration, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, issued an order saying how government agencies could use variants of AI. And this was before generative AI became widely used by average Americans. But I do think generative AI, because it looks so human, and because it also brought in a new company that for the first time sort of threatened the powers of the incumbents, Google, Facebook, WeChat, et cetera, the biggest companies in the world. All of a sudden, policymakers realized this thing might look kind of human because it looked like it was getting to risks that we hadn't seen before. Moreover, more and more governments were using other types of AI to make decisions about their citizens. So you started to see a focus that I think is a very European focus. How they govern is they try to mitigate risks. And you started to see the United States moving in that direction. So, as example, it's not just Congress, but you have the Federal Trade Commission, which said, the chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission a couple of months ago said, we have everything that we need to regulate AI. Why? We can protect consumers from deceptive business practices. And what are those deceptive business practices? Theft of personal data and misuse of personal data, theft and misuse of copyrighted data, and a lack of rules for people who create content on websites like Facebook or Wikipedia or Reddit that they don't own that content, but it was created by them, and their rights are not governed under current laws. So we're starting to have a debate over how do we govern these technologies in ways that we can mitigate the risks, but as I said before, encourage the technology and build trust.
Great, thank you. So Ryan, obviously all of this is affecting higher education as well. When ChatGPT was released last fall, we all said, oh boy, what does this mean for us in higher education? Can you talk a little bit about what the impact has been and how it is that we are addressing but also embracing the power of AI in higher education?
Yes, so ChatGPT was released by OpenAI on December 1st of last year, which was not an ideal time for higher ed institutions. Final exams were coming, and it blew up on campus. My 9th grader was using it. His teacher was showing kids how to use it. Everyone was using it, probably more so than the faculty were even realizing. So there was lots of concern. We had panels here in early January about how to think about AI entering your classroom, what are going to be the impacts, very well attended by faculty. I would say that some of the panic resided kind of through the spring. We found some ways to work our way through, having more conversations about ethics with students, trying to build space in our classes to have some of that guidance so that they can learn how to use these really valuable tools, but for the good of their education rather than to the detriment. That isn't to say that there's still not rampant cheating. There was rampant cheating before ChatGPT came to campus. And I'm sure there will be 5-10 years from now. Those who cheat will find ways around our systems. But I am happy to say that faculty are also getting very innovative in how we think about these technologies. And at GW, we have great support teams. So we have a whole office of instructional designers who help faculty think through what are the implications to my course. So whether it's a statistics course or an English course or a psychology course, they help us think through kind of how can we integrate the good things of these technologies and also mitigate against some of the challenges that we know are out there. We know it is tempting for students, for example, if there's a high stakes, there's only 2 papers in the whole course. You're pushing students to the limit. And you make it due the day after Thanksgiving break. Are you pushing them to cheat, maybe? Can you rethink of what your course design is? And asking some fundamental questions about what we're teaching and why we're teaching it. And I think this has become kind of an area where not all faculty, but a good number of faculty are starting to go back to their courses and say, is this really the content that I should be teaching? Is this preparing the students for the future they're going to live in? And if not, then how do we want to make changes? And then you can actually use tools like ChatGPT to work your way through some of those conversations. Over the summer, there was an econ professor, not at GW, but somewhere else, who actually posted his conversation with ChatGPT as he redesigned his course. And it was pages long. I mean, he kept going back, and they went back and forth. But it was amazing to see how it was really good at giving counter-arguments. He thought he wanted to do one thing, and he asked it to give counter-arguments to doing that, and it gave valid ones, and he changed his mind and went in a different direction. And I think a lot of people are following that example and finding ways to use the technology, not just to support the students, but to support the faculty as we adapt to this new world we're living in.
I love the way you said that, of how we can use these kinds of tools to better prepare our students for the future. Ignoring it, telling them they can't use it is not going to prepare them for the future, but being more thoughtful about the way that we engage with it is wonderful. Well, so Rebecca, in the computer science department, obviously you're teaching some of your students how to develop and use AI. How are you also addressing some of these other dimensions of it for the people who are going to be innovating these technologies going forward?
Right. So, of course, having a very solid AI foundation curriculum is part of the mission of our department, and we have a series of very good courses for that. But beyond that, there are basic things that I think every citizens should know about. And so we also have courses developing kind of how does computing impact society. We have student organizations, they run hackathons, they have discussions, and so these are all opportunities to discuss a lot of these issues at every level, undergraduate, graduate students. In terms of graduate student, we actually have a joint training program. Maybe I'll let Zoe talk a little bit more about that part too. You want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, so we have a couple of joint programs with computer science and systems engineering because a lot of the deployment of AI in society is a systems problem, but also we are big users of computing. So we have a master's in data analytics, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about how AI is entering the classroom there, and then also our joint PhD program, if that's the handoff you were giving me.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, so I can say it because I'm not a computer scientist, but I don't think that writing the code is the most important part of programming. But you write much better code if you know what you're doing when you ask for help, right? And so this is the how do we train our students for the future. Professional programmers are not writing all their own code anymore, but you can write some really dangerous, really bad code if you just say, like, how do you do this whole thing? But you can get snippets of code and be a good consumer of it. And so that's starting to make its way into a recognition of how we teach it and making the assignments in the class more about the conceptualization of it as opposed to the mechanics of actually doing it. And so then we also have a joint-ish, it's not joint, it's coordinated PhD program under the umbrella of our NSF traineeship, which we got a couple years before the big institute, which is one of NSF's flagship educational programs. And the idea is that you can transform the research that you're doing in these societally important interdisciplinary spaces if you change how you educate students. And so we pitched a program that was going to educate both computer scientists and systems engineering PhD students to, on the one hand, understand the implications of the design choices they were making in the algorithmic development, and on the other hand, have the systems engineers who are really the ones thinking about how new technology plugs into systems, whether it's a decision system or an architecture, to know much more deeply what the technology is doing so they can make better choices about what to do with that. So we're entering our third year of that program right now. We co-teach a research methods class, probably the first ever jointly taught research methods class with computer science and anyone else. And we also have a very active seminar and community of students who are just working with each other and really changing how they think about what interdisciplinary work is by spending so much time together. We're always looking to bring people into the classroom with real problems. One of the fantastic things about GW is how problem-driven it is. And so that's just really changed how we're having that conversation.
Thanks for that. Because I'm still new to GW, I didn't want to talk about the training program so much, so thanks, Zoe, for the backup. In terms of other activities in the computer science department, I think I would like to see in the future more networking opportunities, more research opportunities. Computer science, it's not necessarily just about programming, right? It's also about just thinking about things logically. And it ties really well with many different disciplines. So in my own case, there's a strong tie with linguistics, but some people have ties with cognitive science. In our department, there are efforts going into medical domains, into finance domains, into lots of different kinds of applications. And so all of these students have an opportunity to work with faculty members and gain kind of real world experiences in thinking about these real world problems. And again, kind of echoing what Zoe said about interdisciplinary, I think between the system engineering and computer science, we offer a lot of opportunities for interdisciplinary work.
It's exciting. I think it's a big part of what draws students here is to have those kinds of opportunities. They can study computer science and systems engineering in a lot of different places. They come to GW for these kinds of interactions and opportunities. Well, that's exciting. Well, how about Ryan, from the perspective of the social sciences and the humanities as they're looking at those opportunities around AI, how is that impacting the way that you're working with students, and how are they leveraging the power of AI in the work that they do?
Yeah, at GW we have a long history of academic freedom. So the administration, rightly so, has really left it up to faculty to determine what's appropriate within their discipline. So if you're in a discipline like journalism, and there's a lot of concern over the rights of what gets written and ownership of that, they're taking a more cautious entryway into this, and a lot of the courses might not be permitting the use because they have legitimate concerns about where this lies within their discipline going forward. But then in other disciplines, it's more wide open. We have professors like Dr. Joybin in the English department who has students using multiple different AI systems as they look at English literature, and she studies Shakespeare in particularly. She also heads up our Digital Humanities Institute. They're doing a series of seminars this year. It actually started in the spring on AI and the humanities and looking at what are the applications of AI in humanities-focused disciplines, both how they can influence the development of AI and how AI might influence their development going forward. We also have a very active ecosystem throughout the social sciences of people who are using programming and coding and now AI tools in really interesting ways. So there's a lot of students that aren't in the engineering school who might be in political science or psychology who are using technology, whether it's coding through Python or now linking into AI systems, which is remarkably easy. I do not have a computer science degree. I'm come out of an ed school. But yet I can write code and I can access Bard or ChatGPT and create content in really interesting ways. And we have students doing this all the time on campus, and we have support for them where they can collaborate with other students who aren't necessarily looking at it from an engineering perspective, but they might be looking at a database that has political science data in it, and they want to know how to analyze it. They want to know how to do predictive things with it. And these tools have gotten to a point where it is easy for those of us who are outside of computer science and engineering to make good use of them as well. Now, there are risks in that, and we have to talk a lot about that with our students. There's ethical challenges. There's risk in the security and privacy of data that we may not know about because we're not trained in those areas. So we have to do this in collaboration with people with greater experience in those. But it's amazing how it has really opened up in so many different disciplines. And we see students eager to get involved and find ways to use these technologies.
Truly a pan-university effort. It's exciting.
May I add something
yes,
to
please.
this? So I teach students that are in the real world. And this is one of, I think, GW's comparative advantage, and you all know this. Our location in Washington gives us great access. Many of our students are policymakers. And we're lucky to have that. And so, for example, Zoe does work with, I believe, the Air Force. And I do work with I train WTO staff, the World Trade Organization. The reason I bring this up is that in the real world today, it is shocking, on one hand, how much policymakers know and how little they know. And I just want to give you an example from the news. That example is the Screenwriters Guild settled their strike this week. And one of the components of the new contract is, can AI write a script, right? And so is AI essentially, can that be copyrighted? Can that be seen as almost the equivalent of a human product? And the answer in the contract is no. But many policymakers are struggling to understand this. How do you deal with this? And countries have had court cases along these lines that have come that are different. Canada's approach is very different from the United States approach. I won't go into detail on it, but we're going to have to find common ground on this internationally because the data sets are global. The companies producing many different types of AI are global, and we're just not there yet. I want to give you another example of this. Right now in the world, we have rules governing personal data. We have rules governing proprietary data, like data that is created by the firm, the intellectual property of the firm. We have rules governing data delivered by government, right? Data you paid for as taxpayers, right? Data either that US grants paid for or data about the citizens in the United States. And then we have what I said before, data you create as a content creator, but there's no rules for that. And that data says something about you, but it is also your creativity. And so it was interesting, this week the New York Times had an article by Emma Thompson, who was talking about basically, how can you consider this content creation? It is creation, it is different from human creation. So she's basically saying, I don't like this. It cannot be seen as the equivalent to human. Whereas, one of Elon Musk's girlfriends, Grimes, a well-known pop singer, says, I love this. And I want to benefit financially from it. So society's adapting, and GW is adapting by trying to teach these diverse perspectives.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and these societal dimensions. I mean, one of the words that we talk a lot about here at GW is trust, and that's come up a couple times on the panel. And one of the things that I often say is, as engineers, we often think about trust as a technical problem to be solved, but it's actually a social construct, of course, that varies across our world. And so you are one of the faculty leaders of our new $20 million NSF funded AI Institute, TRAILS, Trustworthy AI in Law and Society. This is a tremendous accomplishment of Susan, David Broniatowski, who's in systems engineering, and a number of other faculty from around the university. Can you tell us more about TRAILS and the impact that it can have on our world and addressing these issues?
So the idea behind TRAILS is that there is no trust. What we talked about what trust is, right? It's your willingness to take a leap of faith, whether it is at any level of relationship, right? So you trust in that the laws in the United States will be enforced. You trust that, when your husband says he's going to be late for dinner and he doesn't come till 8 o'clock, the reason he said he was late was the reason. And so what we're trying to do is embed trust in every level of AI design, development, deployment, and governance. So I brought this little piece of paper to say that our vision is to transform the field of AI from we just wrote this, so that's why I don't have it memorized, but I'll try my best. But to transform the field of AI from tech first to people first, where AI systems are developed and governed in a way that promotes human rights, right? That's key to having the trust at the individual level, then at the group level, right? Whether the group is 2 people or 6 million people, and serves the interests of people who use it. So we're going to have, we've been doing research already, although we just got the grant in June, and we will be holding convenings, we will be training. We work a lot with high school students and teachers to ensure that they understand the systems and are capable of designing systems that can build trust. And again, it's built on a notion that the technology is going to be evolving faster than we all can keep up with it. The only way to build trust is to make it a systemic approach. And this is why people who are systems engineers are so important, right? That the system of governance reflects the system, the technological system, and that system should serve the interests of the people. We put people first.
Good, yeah, that's worthy of clapping, absolutely. No, it's exciting. As President Granberg said, this university is about dealing with real problems in the real world, having not just research that is going to sit on the shelf, but is going to have a positive impact on the world. So stay tuned, everyone, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about TRAILS in the years ahead. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the power and perils of AI in a variety of contexts, specifically getting into a few different industry sectors. So, for each of these sectors, what can AI enable, but what do we need to be careful about when using AI? So for example, I know that financial investment firms are leveraging the power in AI in investment decisions, some to tremendous success, but I'm not sure how I feel about entrusting my 401k to ChatGPT. And so, there's obviously some really tricky issues there, many of which come down to trust. So Rebecca, I'll start with you. How about in the medical space? Obviously, tremendous opportunity there, but also some risks.
Absolutely. So in the medical domain, there has been a long history of AI involvement, right? So it's not the modern system, but even in the old days, they have these systems that are called expert systems, where basically it says, if you match this, then say that. And it's a very complicated, lots and lots of cases. And so that would be an example of a way to help doctors diagnose, right? So you're putting all the symptoms and you see what it says. Doctors obviously have their own training, so they're not just relying on the system, but it's a good second check. There are systems that kind of does information retrieval, or basically kind of, if you want to look up something, it'll go through the medical library, the National Health Medical Library, and extract relevant documents for you, because people are generating all of these literature about all the different kind of medicines development. It could help you with drug discovery. It could help you with, and in my own personal experience, help with electronic health records, right? So the hospitals have all of these records, and you want to look through the history of this patient and see if there's anything that should pop out. And so these are all the different ways that artificial intelligence of one form or another could help you diagnose cancer by looking at medical images, right? So that's computer vision. Recently, actually, I wanted to brag about one of our faculty member. He recently has a joint grant from the Gates Foundation to work on improving medical access in Nigeria, because it's a low resource place. They don't have as much help. And so something like ChatGPT could serve as a second opinion. So they can kind of say the doctor has an interaction with the patient, and then the ChatGPT can kind of go through that transcript and then come up with kind of a summary or a alternative, and then that could also be presented to patients. But if you hear about all of this, you might feel a little bit worried, right? So that's kind of the risk side of things. What if there's a wrong diagnosis? What about privacy? So when I worked on electronic health record, one of the first things we always have to do is de-identify everybody, and we want to make sure that the symptoms that we're reading about doesn't, even just from the symptoms, identify a patient in some way. So a lot of these things have kind of both a pro and con, and sometimes it comes down to, you might have to weigh, is the benefit outweighing the risk? And sometimes the answer is maybe, and sometimes the answer is maybe not. And so I think that's kind of an ongoing exploration. I mean, I think there's potentially huge benefits, but there's also potentially huge risks. And so we do have to kind of think about it both ways.
Well, some really interesting challenges too on the policy side, liability issues, malpractice insurance for your AI doc. So some interesting challenges there. Ryan, you were talking a little bit earlier about some professors who are engaging with AI and pushing education forward along these lines. What is and Zoe mentioned before jobs being replaced. I mean, what is? Are we talking about AI professors, AI deans? Do I need to worry about my job?
So I think that there will definitely be some issues that come in the job market from this, because some people will have the skills to use the tools more effectively than others, and they will have an advantage in the job market. So if you have two marketing students who graduate and they go out to compete for a job, and one is fluent in using ChatGPT to help create marketing content, and they can produce 8 marketing content pieces a day. And you have another student who is not familiar and can only do 2 or 3 a day because they're not using these technologies. There's definitely going to be a comparative advantage for the student who can use these tools. And it is going to change our lives and how we work in different ways. Zoom announced recently that they'll be offering it in the spring as an integrated part of the Zoom platform, for those who pay for it, of course. But it will be recording and keeping the transcripts of meetings, and then you'll be able to refer back to that. So you could be in a meeting today, and if you want to bring up data and have reminders about what you decided 3 months ago, you will just ask the AI component, I think they're calling it Q, You'll go, Q, who did we decide was going to be in charge of this 3 months ago? Or can you bring up the data that looks at our female students versus our male students, and how are we doing on these different aspects? So instead of having to say, we'll get back together in 2 weeks after someone runs some Excel spreadsheets, you'll have the data right there. And that's going to change dynamics in teams. How do you work differently with your human counterparts? There's still going to be human value added, and we're trying to figure out where the human value added begins and ends, and where the machine value added begins and ends. And so I think we're starting to see the beginnings of this. And you can see it in our kids, probably most of all. My kids are using ChatGPT all the time. So I have a 7th grader and a 10th grader. And it's wonderful in many ways. It can give you 10 examples of a concept, while your teacher may just offer you 1. So my older son was taking a personal econ course for high school over the summer. The examples were okay, but they didn't speak well to a 9th grader trying to understand interest rates. So we put it into ChatGPT. It doesn't care. Ask it for 10 examples, 20 examples, and it will just produce them. And I think this is kind of a fundamental concern that the philosophers and the educators and others are starting to look at, is how does this change how we view knowledge creation? How do we create new knowledge? Is it creating new knowledge? How do we value that new knowledge? We haven't had major shifts in how we think about knowledge since the Enlightenment, but could we be starting to see another phase where we have a different idea and concept of where knowledge comes from, what makes it? Is it just people, or is it now machine intelligence too? And then what is the value of that knowledge? It costs me the same to ask ChatGPT for 1 example as it does 10 or 100. So that definitely changes the value of knowledge in a very fundamental way that we're just now starting to realize, and now we can start to study it in different ways. And it's going to be interdisciplinary. So I think, again, GW's poised to do very well in this space because it's going to be psychology, sociology, law, engineering, having to come together to grapple with these issues.
I know we're seeing similar kind of questions come up around self-driving cars, thinking about mobility and autonomy. Zoe, can you talk a little bit about power and perils there?
Sure. And so I'm not going to talk about ChatGPT with self-driving cars, even though apparently Elon Musk is trying to use some generative AI to train his driving systems. But one of the big questions with urban mobility is about equity and access. We build public infrastructure, and then we use it for as long as we possibly can, right? But where people live changes over time. And so as far as promise, one of the ideas is that if we could have self-driving cars, or even an extension of what the Lyfts and the Ubers of the world are doing to bridge gaps and create access to people who can't afford to live close to the city, can't afford to live close to public transit. But now maybe if it can get cheap enough, if you don't need a human in the car, that you could get them access. Or people who feel isolated because they can't drive anymore. As people age, if they lose their ability to drive, then this might be a way to be able to do that. That's the promise. And in a lot of these cases, we start out with some really great ideas about how everything is going to change for good. But what we found is when we start doing this, people often forget some really simple questions that should be asked about what that's actually going to do as far as dynamics. So let's just take the geriatric part of this, because it's a little bit easier to think about. If you're sending a self-driving car out to pick someone up who has a mobility problem, the self-driving car can't help them into the car. It can probably open the trunk, but it can't lift anything into the back. And that's a really big problem. The function of the driver wasn't just to drive the car. And so we have to be able to ask these questions and think about the implications. And so what you end up with is these self-driving rollouts are very good for young people who could afford to buy their car anyway most of the time. And we haven't really thought about that in a systemic way. And so as we've made mistakes like this, we're starting to ask these questions a little bit better. But it's very complicated, and it's a very systemic question. It's not just about the capability of the technology. For me, it comes back to what are all the tasks that the people in the system are doing? How does that change the allocation when we replace parts of their functions, but not all of their functions? Humans are the most flexible technology we have in a lot of these systems, and we forget all the extra things that are just kind of happening for free. And so you really have to think through those, or we might end up with a much less equitable version, even though the goal was really a good one to try to gain access to everyone in a city context.
Well, this has been fantastic, and I have so many more questions for you, but I really want to leave some time for the audience to ask questions as well. We haven't even gotten to some of the interesting issues around bias and some of the ethical considerations, but I'm sure some of our audience members have those questions. So we have a couple of microphones running around, so please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll bring a microphone around to you.
Thank you. I have a question concerning the self-driving cars and sort of the ethics of programming those cars. Many years ago, I read an interesting article, will your car be programmed to kill you? And the algorithms that decide collision avoidance, when those are being created, I mean, is the car going to avoid the school bus, or is it going to, it's the trolley problem, but it's in real life because those cars have to be programmed to do something. So how are those sort of ethics in these cars, how are they being programmed in that collision avoidance if the decision has to be between the kid in the stroller or another vehicle? Or are they even programmable to be biased in the way that someone unethical could say, well, you can hit this color person, but avoid striking and killing this color person? I mean, there's just a lot of inherent bias that might come in where a human won't be able to make that type of distinction that quickly, but a car can. And so I'm just very curious about how that's sort of being addressed in the ethics of this type of programming.
Great question. Someone want to jump in and take that?
You go ahead.
Everybody's
I guess I
turning to
opened
Zoe.
up the... All right. So I'm not going to be able to fully answer that question, and I'll say I'm a systems engineer, not a philosopher. And we probably need someone else on the panel to be able to get it a little bit further. So these are obviously extremely important questions. I don't mean to joke about it. But if you look at the number of traffic accidents that happen in the US right now, it's astronomical. I'm always surprised when I look it up. I can't tell you the number off the top of my head. But people kill people in cars much more than any of the self-driving cars do as well. That doesn't mean that we don't have to think hard about which decisions are being made. The good news is that most of the autonomy that's going into these vehicles is more still autonomy. We aren't in too many places doing full self-driving, and in those places we're still monitoring. How much a monitor can actually do is an open question as well. But people are asking the trolley problem question kind of all the time. And now this also gets into where and when is regulation useful. So it's an interesting contrast when you think about autonomy in vehicles. The aviation industry is extremely regulated, and the vehicle industry is not, almost at all. Usually it comes in after the fact. Whereas before you can fly any autonomous vehicle in the sky, there's a huge amount of work that goes into proving how it's going to work. And that actually gets into to me, one of the most fundamental tensions here about the opportunity for innovation and regulation. There's kind of two approaches. One takes a safety perspective and says, we are not going to do anything that we don't know. Trust doesn't really even come in as much because we just say we're only going to operate under the conditions that we can prove it can behave the way that we want to. And that's what systems engineers were taught how to do. That's what we do with airplanes. We have no accidents because we don't fly the most performing vehicles that we can. And we pollute a lot, a little bit. Not exactly directly because of it, but it certainly constrains the trajectory, but it makes it very, very safe. On the other hand, if you take an ethics approach, it's trying to agree on a set of values and knowing that you can't know all the conditions, but hoping if we get the values right, that everything is going to happen after that. And that's a different perspective on how you do this. It requires much more of a leap of faith, and it requires us to agree on the values. And so the trolley problem is interesting because I don't think all the humans in the room could agree what the right answer was, even if they could work at light speed, which explains why having an ethical framework that focuses on agreeing on your values up front is just so difficult. We probably need both of these perspectives because there's some places where safety is more important, and there's some places where maybe we can agree on the values and try to go from there. But it's it's a great question because it's a question we can't really answer here, and maybe one of my colleagues wants to take a stronger stance on one of the sides.
I guess I'll jump in a little bit on kind of a, well, sometimes it's also hard to predict what's going to happen. So this doesn't directly address your question, but potentially when we initially think about the problem, that didn't even come up, right? So when we're designing the system, we're often trying to think, okay, we have an objective, and maybe our objective is wrong. And so this is something that we have to also revise as we learn more. Ideally, if we kind of take a more proactive approach, our objective the first time through would be already well thought out and minimize the number of times we have to go through and think about revising. But coming from kind of my experience as a computer scientist, computers surprise me a lot. Like I think, oh, I have it all right. And then it does something, I go, oh, I didn't think that it was going to do that. And then I look through the program, and in fact, it executes each step exactly the way I intended it to. It's just that I hadn't realized that it was going to do something different. That there's kind of this weird side effect or something unintended that I didn't think of. And so as the designer of the system, we kind of bear that responsibility. And I think, you know, bringing up these sorts of questions, these policy questions, these ethical questions, we should do that early rather than late, so that we don't have to go back and revisit as often.
Well, and I know that one of the cornerstones of the Trails Institute is participatory AI, so we're getting more people's voices incorporated into these types of discussions and decisions early on in the process, not just, as Zoe said, after the system is deployed.
I want to just, the trolley problem has been, you know, in a sense, it's an existential problem. It's been around for forever, and it's always going to be around, right? Because we as a society, norms are never absolute. And what I mean by that is that they are constantly challenged by behavior. I just cite a certain guy, fat guy who lives in Florida, you know, in terms of the judicial system. So this is not the only venue. And I think we just need to accept that it is very difficult to evolve new norms or to change norms over time, but that is the challenge, and that's why a systemic approach, you know, we have to try to involve people. But I want to give you an example using a totally different technology of what a government is trying to do to anticipate these kinds of things. So as part of Trails, I recently wrote a paper that was published, and it looked to, is the public, you know, the US government, right, has this long tradition. We can only have trust if we ask the public what they think, and then we listen to them and we try to respond in ways that accepts their opinion. So we did a study of the 69 governments that are in the EU, that are EU plus 68 nations, so 69 governments. And every single one of the nations that had an AI strategy, and that was 43, consulted their publics, but only 4 actually listened to what their public had to say. In general, who did they listen to? Business executives, professors, the elite. And so we have to find ways to bring in those voices. So the EU has decided their big thing is they're not going to miss the boat on what, you know, my personal best friend Mark Zuckerberg calls the metaverse, but let's call virtual worlds, right, which are built on AI too. And so what the EU did is last summer, they invited average Europeans, and they basically paid them a small amount, come to classes on virtual worlds, and then we're going to poll you to see how you think we should govern these future virtual worlds. And, you know, that might be an idiotic way to go, you know, because those people were paid, so there might be some bias there. Okay, so that's one approach. Another approach is actually built on AI. I kind of love this approach. It's called swarm AI, and it builds on, you know how schools of fishes make decisions, flocks of geese. And so the idea is there's this hidden consensus among human beings. Can we use AI to find that consensus, and in so doing, here, redress the trolley problem by saying, here's what most people think is the problem, and here's where we can find common ground on addressing it. And an example where, you know, swarm AI has been used is on gun control. You know, we can't regulate guns or ammunition, but maybe we can regulate public health related to the use of guns, that kind of thing. So what I'm trying to say is that society is evolving. This problem has always been with us. Society is evolving as new technologies make the problem harder or easier, right? And we're going to use technologies in some ways to do a better job of this.
Other questions?
Hey, thanks for taking the time here. I'm curious what everyone thinks about the role that generative AI is going to play in the upcoming election. How well or poorly do you think we're situated as a society to navigate those dynamics? And if there's anything that you're looking towards in terms of mitigating some of the concerns and risks that it poses?
That's a great question, and now is a good time for a plug too for our GW's Institute for Data Democracy and Politics that looks at a lot of these kinds of issues here. Also a pan-university institute that is looking at things like disinformation, misinformation, and how that impacts public opinion and the democratic process. And so it's a very timely question. Do you have thoughts on this?
I have lots of thoughts, but not much information,
But no
which is
disinformation.
where we are 9 months into having generative AI widely available. It makes content creation cheap and easy. So do expect to get flooded with content, because why would you not if you were a political campaign? It can write 10,000 email messages that look customized to you. So you'll think you're getting a customized message when you're not. There used to be greater cost in that. And it'll be interesting. We're probably not ready. What I'm seeing of the research is people seem to think AI is very credible, even when it's not. So there's something in our psychology maybe that we're ready to be duped a little, and there's going to be consequences to that as we go forward. It could be one of those things, though, where we don't know it until it's already happened to us, which we've seen in elections prior to.
I guess I wanted to jump in briefly on this. I think people should people probably do take responsibility in the sense that we know it's coming, and so we're also vigilant about it. So, for example, one thing that people might be worried about is generative AI coming up with kind of essentially photoshopped images, right? That's
Deepfakes.
Exactly. And people kind of know that, and so people are vigilant against it and when they see a picture, they kind of ask themselves, is this real? Do I see any clues that might show that it's generated? And so I think on the one side, there will be a lot of content being generated, but I think on the other side, there will also be critics who look at it and say, do we trust this? How much do we trust this? At least that's my hope. And my hope is that this will somehow balance out, and so that even if there were a lot of extra generated content, that there would also be extra checks just amongst the public, that it's in our interest to do this. And I encourage all of you to go out there and check everything carefully, right? In the end, it comes down to responsibilities of as an individual. This was true before ChatGPT and all of this, right? If you see a news article, it's important to kind of ask ourselves, do we believe that? How much do we believe that? Is it trustworthy? And I think that's even more true now than ever. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
I have a different perspective on this. Well, first of all, none of this is new, right? Loose lips sink ships, right? We have been constantly subjected to a barrage of, on one hand, defenses, and then on the other hand, propaganda. So there's nothing new here. The new is in the how. And I am less worried about that because photos, for example, can be watermarked. But so you can determine if it was AI generated, so faked. I am much more concerned about manipulating people. And everybody remembers Cambridge Analytica, right? Where, some say, thanks to Facebook sharing data with researchers, some of whom had scholarly integrity and some of whom didn't, and one of the ones who didn't was a firm called Cambridge Analytica, which took Facebook information and, some of that information revealed through examining lots of data where people could be manipulated. And so I'm deeply concerned about mass manipulation of people. That is why I'm not on Facebook, because they continue to have real problems in terms of protecting their data and also, selling that data. So one way to protect against it is indirect. So there's a couple of ways. The FEC, regarding what Rebecca was talking about, is considering regulating deepfakes. We'll see, related to elections. I don't think they're going to find common ground on that, but that's a start. Other governments regulate it. I can see the trade regime regulating disinformation. We could talk about that at another time. There's lots of governments have agreed to rules governing cross-border disinformation flows, but my gut is in this election it'll be US generated. Not only, but a lot of it is. And we as a society have not come to terms with that. This is an example, but that is not the focus. I would start with the business practices of the firms. There's lots of ways to regulate AI, right? You can regulate the data, you can regulate the risk, you can regulate the use, you can regulate the business practice. So what business practice am I talking about? Selling data, right? That would be one. Another is surveillance capitalism, right? So I'm presuming everybody knows what that means. But basically using your data, and the business model is that you use that personal data to make predictions, and you then sell that to other companies or other uses, including the US government, right? Can we predict that this refugee could be a terrorist? So, we need to think long and hard, but it can't be done by, just academics talking to Congress or, CEOs talking to Congress. It has to be other people, teachers, doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, farmers, whomever.
Thank you very much. This panel has been amazing. We have a daughter who's a freshman here at GW, and then two younger children, 14 and 16 years old. And I have two questions. One is about education, and on a related note about policy. So in terms of education, I think, the way I'm thinking about it is there's benefit and risk of using AI in education. So the benefits are it can generate ideas or outlines or give your son the examples of economic problems, or it can solve proofs. But the risk is that the kids, especially the younger kids, don't learn how to think. They don't learn how to write a paper. They don't learn how to write, introductory paragraphs and transitions or to solve proofs. And so what do we do to make sure that the kids are learning the skills they need to learn? And, using it to cheat is one thing, but I think further upstream is just the question of have they learned the skills they needed to? And that's not something that we all have to worry about because we did go through those rote kind of lessons of how to think, but I worry about it for our kids. And then on the policy side, my question is whether there is talk of something like watermarks on anything that's AI generated so that a teacher would know, did you generate this, or is this something that Bard generated and you're handing in?
Well, I think the essence of the question is, what is need to know? When I grew up, I had to learn cursive. It was very important my mom was a third grade teacher. It was very important we learn cursive. Our kids do not learn cursive today. They learn keyboarding skills. So they have terrible handwriting, but they can type really fast. Who defines what is need to know? And is that shifting and changing? I think that they may lose some skills in terms of writing, and thus they're going into certain professions. I'm not sure if I'm that worried about that. If we can use it in other ways to get further into critical thinking. Now, critical thinking has been a term widely thrown around universities and high schools for a long time, but it's always been very superficial. It's like, oh, we teach critical thinking skills. They write a comparison contrast paper. That's the surface of what is critical thinking. But you can use AI to really do deep dives into these things. So there's another econ professor who's using AI to have his students look at modern day economic challenges, and they're doing interviews with long dead economists like Milton Friedman. Now it works well. They can simulate Milton Friedman quite well because he was very verbose, wrote lots of books, gave lots of speeches. AI learned a lot about him. But it allows students not to just write a comparison contrast paper, but to actually think more deeply from other perspectives. And they could do it not just for one, they could do it for 3 different economists. How would Marx compared to Friedman, compared to our modern economists, Summers and others? And again, it's very good at this. It allows them to think deeper on issues. And maybe we'll have to sacrifice in some places to make gains in other places. And those are challenging questions. These are not things that faculty take lightly. Some faculty will want to dig in and continue to teach what they've always taught. Other faculty are going to be pushing the vanguard. And in the middle is probably where we will end up. And that's probably a good place to be, where we're going to have to realize some things will change, just like I have to look at my kid's handwriting and not cringe that it's so terrible, but instead focus on their keyboarding skills, because that is most of what they're going to do. They're going to do that much more than write in cursive to send letters to their grandma, who's probably the only one who could read it anyway, because I still get thrown by her cursive writing. But I think those are the debates that we're having in higher ed, or starting to have, and we're going to have a lot more of them within each of our disciplines. As for the policy question, they've talked about doing watermarking. OpenAI, who owns ChatGPT, has been talking about it. It's an engineering challenge, as my engineering colleagues would tell you. But we have to remember, too, they're not the only game in town. Bard, who is owned by Google, is another system. Meta, who used to be Facebook, has their system. There are at least 10 to 15 good open source systems that you could download onto your computer if you have a really good computer and run your own version of ChatGPT. That's not quite as good, but it's probably 85% as good. And those aren't regulated. No one's making up rules about those, which gets us into some of the bias questions. We like some level of bias. We like that OpenAI has put additional bias into their ChatGPT. I don't worry about what my kids are going to find. There's ethical challenges maybe in how they've done that. They've used underpaid labor to do a lot of that. Whereas Google with Bard, they over-biased it, in my opinion. They limited it so much they had reputational risk that OpenAI didn't. And it doesn't work that well because it's been over-biased. They've limited down. But there's also a model that was trained on the dark web, and it has all the pornography sites and stuff in it. I don't want my kids using that model. So I want bias, but I want the bias I like, which is a real conundrum. How do organizations respond to that? And they'll respond differently. And to some degree, the economists out there would say the market will sort it out. But there's going to be a lot of chaos in that as we look at these open source models that are freely available. If a kid with a good GPU on his computer can run it, they won't even have to have a ChatGPT. It won't be an issue. They'll get their same type of content elsewhere that won't be watermarked.
Well, we are coming up on time here. I had said before we didn't have more faculty on stage, or otherwise we'd be here till Tuesday. I think we could be here till Tuesday, continuing this conversation. It's so fascinating. But I do want to give our panelists 45 seconds each for some final comments, and then we'll send you off to enjoy the rest of this beautiful day. Rebecca?
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I had a fun time talking to all of you, and I hope that we'll have more chance to talk later. I say my final words are AI is interesting, but it's not scary. There are many opportunities, and sure, there are also risks, but I feel that I tend to be optimistic about this. I feel that we can move forward and we will hopefully keep most of the good and minimize the bad.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions and the great discussion for the panelists. My closing remarks, I guess. So one of the things that drew me to GW was that I could live in an ivory tower in a big city where you can have impact. And I think that's so true about how we're approaching these kinds of problems. And I mean that across disciplines and across perspectives. Because a lot of these questions, you can have theoretical discussions about the philosophy or the sociology of it, and very, very deeply technical questions about how to develop the technology. But if you're not bringing those two together, you could easily end up regulating the wrong things away. And not enabling the innovation, but also not taking advantage of what the opportunities are. And I think what we're doing here is a really nice balance of trying to help invent the good future and not the bad future. And I don't mean that just in terms of the technology, it's also the institutions. And that means that education is a big piece of this. So the last question, that was a great question. It's something that I think we all really care about. Because we think about our role as educators as, I love the phrase from Trails, K to Congress. We're educating the students here, but we also have a lot of explaining to do about how the choices that we make actually play out at the systems level. And continuing to interact with people who change how we think about things is a big piece of that, and that's why we like doing these kinds of discussions.
Susan?
Well, let me reiterate, thank you so much for coming. I want to bring up something that really concerns me, building on something that Ryan said, which is our system is built on trust, right? All democratic systems are built on that, the relation that you can trust that another human being delivers what they say they do. And if they don't deliver, there are all forms of societal punishments. But now, more and more, we are going to get our information from AI sources, large platforms that own AI. Some are government controls, like one of the best in the world of generative AI is produced by the UAE. And I want to just get into the issue of openness and access to information. So I am not saying that there will be less access to information, but I want you to think about whether that information is controlled by a few corporate entities and thus limited to some degree, controlling the reuse of that. It's just something to think about. That is what worries me about AI, that it can alter what we think is the way that we should be as a society. In a democracy, if the public does not have access to information, there is no democracy. We can't then take that information and say to our member of Congress, we want you to do X, Y, or Z. We don't, we always have to find a balance between openness and things that are secret. And I worry that corporations, just as they are not so great at regulating disinformation, they may not be so great at regulating when to limit access to information. Many scientists are very concerned about hallucinations because they feel they misrepresent their information that they work so hard to replicate. The fact is we're getting information from chatbots, some of which are open and some of which are closed. So we don't know where they got their information from and whether or not they actually tested if it was, as I said before, accurate, complete, and representative. So I want to say to you all, think about that when you go and use a chatbot or any other form of AI. Is it built on data that you can trust? I'm not saying that Google has bad intentions or OpenAI has, but I do think that if you want to see a world where information is widely shared, they should then be told they need to tell us where they got that information from and how they got that information and why are they sharing this information and not that information.
Ryan.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing that I say to my colleagues when I talk with them about it. Get informed. If you haven't been trying these, try it out. ChatGPT, the prior model 3.5 is free. So you just go to chat.openai.com or maybe IO, I don't remember. and try it, and then have lots of conversations. I tell my colleagues that students are going to learn about these, and they're going to form their ethics about AI in our classrooms. And it's our duty to talk to them openly about what are the norms, what are the standards, how should we think about them philosophically, ethically within our disciplines, because they're looking to us for that guidance. And as a parent, my kids are looking to me for that guidance. And as a son, my mom is looking to me for that guidance. At 81, she's trying to use ChatGPT and stay informed. So it's on us to use it, learn about it, and then talk with others about it and form our own opinions, and then decide if we want to keep using it. But people are looking to us to do these things, and that's an important responsibility, I believe.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists today. So my final word is just a quick plug for our second annual Global Business and Policy Forum that we'll be holding in here and on April 2nd, which will be on, you guessed it, AI. So stay tuned for some communications and additional announcements about that in the coming months. Thank you for joining us here today. This has been a wonderful weekend, and we hope you enjoy the rest of it. Thanks again.